Hi, my name is Aya. You're watching Aya Reads, and I'm here to talk about my most disappointing books that I read in 2023. So these are not books that I hated. If you want to know my books I hated, I did a video on that, so I'll leave that linked for you. In fact, some of these I will definitely be recommending. Some of these are actually 4 stars. The reason most of them were disappointments is because my expectations were just so very high, either because the book was very hyped before I picked it up, or it was part of a series that I really loved, but this one just was a letdown. So like I said, definitely does not mean that I hated all these books. In fact, I didn't hate any of them. They were just disappointing for several reasons. So let's go through them. I'm not gonna spend a whole lot of time on each book. I'm just gonna give you a short synopsis and tell you why it was such a disappointment to me. The first one is The Heart Principle by Helen Huang. So this one I actually gave 4 stars, so I do definitely see myself recommending it. Just the reason it was this disappointment for me is because I really love The Kiss Quotient. That is one of my favorite books, and then the second and this third book just didn't really live up to it. Plus, Kwan was a character that I was very much anticipating his love story, and this just, it wasn't really Kwan's book, it was Anna's book, which I get why, especially considering Helen's home life and what she's went through. So I get why. You don't have to explain to me why this ended up being what it was. I'm sure it was very cathartic for her to write this. It's just at the end of the day, I was disappointed because I really wanted Kwan's love story, and ultimately we only got like a snippet of his love story, and yeah, that is why this was so disappointing to me. Basically, this is about a violinist named Anna and this tattooed motorcycling Kwan. Kwan is the cousin of the hero from the first book and the brother of the hero from the second book. So like I said, not just me, but I'm sure a lot of us had been anticipating his book. And ultimately it ended up being Anna's story and her being a caregiver for her very sick father. And yeah, it just, like I said, it's still 4 stars. I would recommend it, but I was just disappointed that I didn't get to see more Kwan and more of his story. Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez. So this is actually, I really loved a lot about this book. Basically, this is about Brianna and Jacob, and they get off on the wrong foot because he has social anxiety and she just interpreted everything that he did as just bad. So one day he decides to write her a letter explaining everything, and she writes letters back, and eventually they start fake dating, and ultimately that ends in their romance. The reason why I'm so sad about this book and why ultimately it was a disappointment is because a lot of people were really hyping this book up. It was a lot of people's favorite book that they read. A lot of people were recommending it, and having read it, I do understand why, because the things I loved about this book, I really loved. So that is why I'm sad that the things that I didn't love ultimately ended up overshadowing the things I did really love, because at the end of the day, if you really look at chapters or pages of them actually being happy together, that is few and far in between. It's either all these miscommunications, or it's them fake dating and thinking that the other one doesn't love them as much as they love them, or like it doesn't want to be with them for some reason. And I felt like Brianna knew so well how to deal with his social anxiety, except for in her own relationship. So that ultimately is, I also didn't really love it. But like I said, I still gave it 4 stars. It's very high 4 stars. But yeah, it was disappointing because of the hype, and also because of the fact that I did really love a lot of things about this book, but the things I didn't love ultimately just overshadowed it for me. The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. So once again, a 4-star book, but this was so hyped for me. Like this has been hyped for years. When I picked it up, I just assumed it was gonna be a 5-star book and I was gonna love it with my whole heart and soul. And ultimately it ended up being a 4-star. This is not a bad book by any means. I just think that the hype really got to me, which is why I ended up being disappointed. It just didn't live up to the hype for me. Yeah, basically this is about these 2 sisters. One of them is in the French Resistance and the other one is just like a mother and waiting for her husband, I believe, to come home, but a German soldier has to live at her house. I do understand why people love this book so much. It's just, I think this was just way too overhyped for me. When I picked it up, I just expected like magic and just heartbreak and everything. And at the end of the day, this was a good book. It's just not my favorite book. It wasn't a 5-star by any means. So I guess that's where my disappointment lies. Sword Heart by T. Kingfisher. This is a cozy fantasy about this older woman. She has to get married to somebody that she doesn't want to get married to. So she plans on actually ending her own life. So she gets this sword And while she's trying to do that, this man pops out of the sword and he has to protect her. Once again, a very, very hyped book. I think overhyped in my opinion. I know a lot of people whose opinions I really trust really loved it. So once again, I just assumed that I was gonna love it too. Ultimately, this book ended up being pretty forgettable to me. These characters were forgettable. While I was reading it, I was having a good time. I ended up giving it 4 stars. I do definitely understand why people really like this. Yeah, at the end of the day, there was a romance in here that I wanted more from. I cannot really give you a whole lot of reasonings why this was a 4 not a 5. I think the main reason is that it was pretty forgettable to me. Like, I think I haven't read enough cozy fantasies to really make my judgment, but for now, I think I need a little bit more plot with my fantasies to really enjoy them, or I just want it to be a fantasy romance. Just after having read this one, that is my conclusion. But like I said, I still need, there are a couple cozy fantasies that I do have my eye on. So yeah, I did really love the fact that these were older characters though. I did enjoy that. Another one that was so disappointing to me is Ship of Magic by Robin Hobb. In fact, the entire Lifeship Traders, I actually DNF'd the 3rd book. So this is the 2nd trilogy in her Elderling world. I had read the 1st trilogy, which starts with the Assassin's Apprentice, and I did really, really love that book. And everybody kept telling me that this trilogy was so much better than the 1st one. So my expectations were through the roof. 1st trilogy really focused on one person, only his point of view, whereas this one was multi-POV, which I really do enjoy that in my fantasies. At the end of the day, I didn't love this series. I couldn't connect to any of these characters. I couldn't root for any of these characters. A lot of them were very annoying to me. And at the end of the day, she writes very long books and they're very slow paced. And I could read that when I could connect to the main character and I was rooting for the main character. Whereas with this book, I wasn't rooting for anybody and I just didn't care at the end of the day. So unfortunately, this was disappointing. I did give the 1st book 4 stars. But like I said, I ended up DNFing this entire trilogy, which is unfortunate because I had such high expectations for this one. Oh, for those of you who don't know, we follow this family that has a life ship. And life ship actually, if 3 generations of a certain family die on a certain ship, this ship actually comes to life and they can navigate different waters that real ships cannot, and multi-POV. And most of them are actually women that we follow. But yeah, ultimately, I didn't love this. It was 4 stars. And I thought, okay, maybe because with the 1st trilogy, I forget the name of that trilogy, I actually didn't love, like, Assassin's Apprentice was not my favorite, but I ended up loving the 2nd and 3rd book. So I figured that was going to happen with this trilogy, and that didn't end up happening. So very sad about this one. Falling into Bed with the Duke by Laureen Heath. So this trilogy was very, very hyped for me, and Laureen Heath was a very hyped author for me. I just figured I'm gonna pick this book up, I'm gonna fall in love with it. I think at the end of the day, I think it wasn't the whole trilogy that was very hyped, it was especially the 2nd book, and I have not read that one yet, so I do need to get on that. But Falling into Bed with the Duke, I gave it 4 stars. It was very enjoyable. It didn't live up to the expectations that I set for this book. Basically, you follow this woman who's very rich. She has a lot of people who want to marry her, but she's not conventionally attractive. So she keeps turning down these proposals, and then one day she decides to go into this sex club where the women have to wear blindfolds because this is a high society sex club and it's to protect the women so that they can have their fun but will not have their reputations ruined. And she starts having a romance with this handsome duke that also knows her in real life. She's afraid that he's not gonna love her once he finds out who she is, and he's also he actually needs money, whereas she wants somebody to love her for her and not because of her money. But he also starts to fall in love with her, but obviously he still needs the money. So this was fun. It was still 4 stars, so it was not bad at all, and I am very much looking forward to continuing on with this series and reading more by Laureen Heath. I do have to say, I'm the type of reader that loves to read series in order and also loves to read interconnected series in order. And I didn't realize that the Hellions of Havisham, so this trilogy, is connected to her other series. I think that is also one of the reasons why I didn't end up loving this book as much as I thought I would, because I believe she wrote about her parents in a previous book before. So I think if had I known that, I wouldn't have started with this trilogy. I would have started with another series by her. So maybe that also has something to do with it. Another very, very hyped book was Still Beating by Jennifer Hartman. Once again, I gave this book 4 stars, and this book was so very hyped for me. Like, you guys know, I have this running list of books that keep being recommended, and this one was very high up on that list, even though it was not a series. So even though it was a standalone, it was very, very hyped. And I just assumed that I was going to love it. I thought, I love dark romance. This premise sounds very interesting to me because it's about this girl who hates her sister's boyfriend, but then they get kidnapped together, and this serial killer wants them to fall in love first. So he forces him to have sex with her, and then ultimately they do end up falling in love. That sounded like a very interesting premise to me. The thing that ultimately made me not give this 5 stars is because I just felt like, and even though if you look at what happened to them, yes, what happened to her is a little bit worse than what happened to him, but he also went through some horrible things, and the decisions that he has had to make was very horrible. And the way that she treated him when they came back was awful to me. I just felt like everybody was just rallying behind her and being there for her, and there was nobody really there for him, even though he also needed that. So there was a big chunk in here where I just felt like the way she treated him was just horrible, and that ultimately made me dock a star. Also, what I also didn't really love is this just should have been what it was. I didn't like there was this storyline where he has loved her all these years. That was not necessary to me because it took away from their love story, in my opinion. I would have preferred if he never really thought about her and always thought about her as the annoying little sister of his girlfriend. And once they went through this harrowing experience together, that's when he realizes that he fell in love with her. I think that is a way more poignant love story than him always having had a crush on her. I don't like that because it just makes the main male character unlikable to me. So those were the 2 reasons why I gave this book 4 stars instead of 5. But I do definitely understand why people love this so much, and I would highly recommend it. It is a beautifully told story. And I am very much looking forward to reading more by her, especially Lotus. I'm very interested in reading. Now, 2 by Sophie Lark, which makes me sad because I have very much loved a lot of books by Sophie Lark, but these 2 were pretty disappointing to me. The first one is actually, I'm going to talk about them together because it's about a father and a son. So the first one is Heavy Crown, and the second one is actually The Heir. Yeah, these 2 were pretty disappointing to me. Let me actually talk about Heavy Crown first. So this follows Sebastian. This is the last book in her Brutal Birthright series, which is one of my favorite series. I really loved reading this series, and I gave 2 of those books 3 stars, and it was very disappointing to me that the very last one, the one who I've been anticipating for a long time, ended up being 3 stars. I really love Sebastian. I've loved him from the first book, and ever since the first book I was very interested in his story because obviously something horrible happened to him in the first book that just completely took away all his dreams, and I really wanted to find out more about him and his, like, how he was going to deal with that. And at the end of the day, Heavy Crown was just a disappointment to me. I didn't like their love story. I didn't like the plot lines in that book. I didn't believe their love story for the first half of this book. The stupid decisions these 2 made. Obviously it was necessary because it set up an entire new series, but I just felt like maybe they should have thought some things through a little bit. Which ends up leading to The Heir, which this follows Sebastian's son. And I was really looking forward to the Kingmakers series. They were so very hyped for me. I was very intrigued, especially The Bully was one I was really looking forward to. So when I picked up The Heir, I just had the highest hopes. I thought it was going to be 5 stars. I thought it was going to be great. It was a mafia school set in a Hogwarts type setting. I was so hyped. And at the end of the day, this just was not my favorite. I do definitely appreciate this book because it does set up the Kingmakers very well. But ultimately, this to me did not really feel like a romance. I thought a lot of time was spent on the world building, on the other characters, which, like I said, at the end of the day was very important because it made the other books very good, but it just took away from this one. I didn't really love their love story. I didn't really believe these 2 really fell in love. I just wish this had been focused a little bit more on the romance. Not that it needed to be spent less on the plot, because like I said, it does set up the rest of the series very well. Maybe that this should have been longer then, even though this is around 500 pages. I just needed the romance to be a little bit more fleshed out. But like I said, I gave both of them 3 stars. Maybe on reread, I'll give them a higher rating. But yeah, there's actually only one book by Sophie Lark that I actively hated, which is in my books I hated video that I did. But yeah, overall 3 stars. I would still recommend it because, like I said, they're part of 2 of my favorite series. But these 2 books in particular disappointed me. Next is another book in a series that I really loved, and it's On the Way to the Wedding by Julia Quinn. So the Bridgertons is an interest. I don't know if you can see that. Very beautiful cover. The Bridgertons is a series that has been up and down for me. Some of them are one of my favorite books I've ever read, especially The Viscount Who Loved Me is one of my favorite romances I've ever read. But I've given more books 3 stars in this series. But I do have to say, this one, Gregory's book, I was looking forward to so much because I did really love Gregory, especially in Hyacinth's book. I was so interested in him as a character and his love story. And at the end of the day, his love story was pretty disappointing to me. Even though this was very entertaining and I did read it very fast, I just felt like we never really got to see this couple together and happy. Even in their epilogue was only focused on her giving birth, not of them actually being in a relationship and being happy together. I think it was the very last sentence of the very last chapter where he's like, I love you, or something. I'm the type of romance reader that does love seeing a couple happy together. So when that's not happening in a book, I just cannot give it a high rating. It's sad because obviously it's the last book in a series. I do have to say it's not my least favorite in the Bridgertons. That one still goes to An Offer from a Gentleman, but this is my second least favorite. Once again, a series ending of a series that I really loved, but the last book was just a disappointment to me, and it's Grim and Buried by Juliet Cross. This makes me so sad that this is on here, and it actually matches me. Stay a Spell series, I really love that series. Some of my favorite books I read this year were in the series, like Witches Get Stitches and Practice Safe Hex. Those 2 I really, really loved. And I had very high expectations for Clara and Henry's book because they have been set up ever since the second book. So I was very excited to read their story. And ultimately, it was kind of disappointing to me. I didn't really love their romance. I felt like I get that their book was very well set up, so it's easy for them to get together like that. And unfortunately for their book, it was just not really realistic to me. I just wanted more time of a little bit of a slower burn to really connect to this character, because it's always different to me when you read about a couple through other point of views as opposed to their own. So I don't care that this book was set up in the other books because we never got to watch them fall in love. We only got to hear about it from her sisters. So yeah, that was kind of disappointing to me. And I was sad because this is the last book in the Stay Spell series. We don't know if we're gonna get a spin-off series. So I would have really loved to read more about more of the rest of the family. Like even in the epilogue, it focused a lot on just Clara and Henry, which is fine, it's their book. But since it's also the last book in the series, she should have made this a little bit longer then, because this is less than 400 pages. She could have easily stretched it out to 450 pages and put more scenes of the rest of the family in here. Also Clara, even though I loved her cheesiness as a side character in the other books, in here, I just didn't really love the whole cheesiness of her. It just kind of made me cringe. I hope the reason we didn't get to see a lot of the epilogue of the families because we're gonna see them again. But I don't think so far she has any actual real plans to write a spin-off. So I just had higher expectations the last book in one of my favorite series. The Professional by Cressley Cole. Oh, this one just gutted me because I really love Cressley Cole. I fell in love with her Immortals After Dark series, and my plan was to read her entire backlist, and I really was interested in the Kingmaker series by her. And I heard such good things about this series, so I just figured The Professional was going to be my gem because it's Cressley Cole. It's also a mafia book. I love those things. And ultimately, this was just so disappointing to me. I didn't really like the hero in this book, and I didn't really believe in this romance. And I felt like the female character had to sacrifice way too much to be with him. I did think the smutty scenes were hot, but that was never a problem with Cressley Cole because she does know how to write smut. And like I said, my expectations were just way too high for this book. I am very much interested to read the second book because I believe that's a lot of people's favorites in this series. At the end of the day, I just didn't love this as much as I thought I would. The main reason why I ended up not really loving this book is because the hero in this book kept constantly pushing the heroine away. And that is fine, but up to a certain point. And this book he kept doing it. Only the last couple of chapters, he was like, fine, we can be together. I didn't enjoy that, especially comparing it to her Immortals After Dark series. Like, those guys just did everything they could to actually be with their heroine. Whereas this one, he was just like, he kept, even though it was clear that she wanted to be with him, he constantly kept doing things because it was better for her. Like, he kept constantly deciding things for her, even though she made it clear that she wanted to be with him. So I don't really love that. That to me is just not a romance then, even though it is technically a romance because it does have an HEA. And next, unfortunately, is The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. This one I read for the Goodreads Choice Award, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time about it. This just, to me, once again, a very, very hyped book. A lot of people really love this book, and I just assumed that I was going to love it. In fact, you can see my reaction. I didn't think this was going to make the top 10, and when it did, I was very happy about it because I really wanted to read it, and I didn't think I could read it this year, if not for the Goodreads Choice Award. So I was very happy that it made it on here. And this to me just did not feel like romance. This to me felt like women's fiction. This was completely focused on Clementine's story. It's also told in single point of view. And this was just about her story. Even their epilogue does barely mention him. And this takes place in like dual timeline for him. So this is a magical realism in a way, but one that I can handle. Basically, her apartment is magical and it sometimes takes you back 7 years in the past. And there she meets this man that she falls in love with. But obviously, he's somewhere in this world because he's now 7 years older. I just felt like we didn't spend a whole lot of time in his present timeline. Like, I understood why she fell in love with him 7 years ago. I just don't understand how they're gonna work in the current timeline. I feel like Ashley should have spent a little bit more time on that as opposed to her and her career and what she wants to do in life. And yeah, a lot of times was spent on grief as well, which honestly, I get there's space for that and that is fine. I just felt like there was a lot of plot points that was focused on and not as much on the romance, which this is a romance. It was nominated for the romance category in the Goodreads Choice Award, and I love romance in my books. And yeah, I just felt like there was too little romance in here, and at the end of the day, it just made the romance a little bit less believable because we didn't spend a whole lot of time watching them fall in love in his current timeline. I just felt like if this was sold in his point of view, like the pining, could you imagine the 7 years pining? I feel like I would have fallen in love with this book, but since it was from her point of view and she only met him like a month ago, it was a little bit less believable. So I ended up giving it 3 stars. I do understand why a lot of people love it. It's just, for me, it just didn't feel like an actual romance. Next is King of Pride by Anna Huang. This makes me sad because her books haven't been 5 stars across the board. I'm actually gonna put a picture here because the white balance messes it up. So I actually gave Twisted Love 3 stars, I gave Twisted Games and Twisted Hate 5 stars, and I gave Twisted Lies 2 stars. So it was always going to be a coin toss whether or not this was going to be 5 stars. And I'm giving it 3 stars, but I do feel like the reason I was disappointed is because this is her second novel. It's one that's traditionally published, so I'm sure she has a great editor. I just had higher expectations for this new series. Not that I think indie romances are less than traditional published books, because that is not the case at all. I just felt like since she has written so many books by this point in her career, I just felt like her Kings of Sin series were going to be 5 stars across the board. I do have to say, I don't love billionaire romances, and most of those are billionaire romances. At the end of the day, I didn't really love it. Like, I just didn't understand why these 2 people fell in love. I felt like there were a lot of other plot points that were focused on that I didn't really care about. I felt like to be honest, this was a 4-star until the third act conflict, and I felt like the third act conflict was shoehorned in. It was not necessary. There was a lot of external conflicts already that she didn't need to have that. And if she wanted to have a third act conflict, it should have been at another point and not where she put it. It took me out of the story because it felt like I immediately was like, oh yeah, the author thinks I need a third act conflict now, as opposed to it being organic. I do have to say, it's obvious Anna Huang loves the Princess Diaries, because there was another scene in here that was very Princess Diaries related, where they were painting but like throwing darts at like balloons with paint. I love that. And I do have to say, King of Greed and King of Sloth were very well set up in King of Pride. I still love Anna Huang. Like I said, I know she has given me some of my favorite books in the past, so I have still very high expectations for the rest of the books in this series, and I still need to read King of Wrath, so I'm very interested to see what I think of that. And the last book that was a disappointment was actually Full Metal Alchemist Volume 1. I actually gave this book 2 stars, and I was like, oh my god, what am I gonna do? This series was so hyped. Everybody seemed to love it. Everybody kept talking about this relationship between these two brothers. And honestly, in the first volume, I didn't see it. I do have to say, ever since then, I've read the second, third, and fourth volume, and I've fallen in love with these two brothers. Especially the fourth volume is a 5-star for me. I really loved it. But I do have to say, I cannot lie, the first one was a disappointment to me. And I do think once I finish the series and once I eventually do a reread, this is not going to stay a 2-star. But for me, this felt like a serialized story of these two alchemists that are saving different towns and not about the brotherly relationship, which this is a first volume. I think this author should have spent a little bit more time on the brotherly relationship, because once, I think this is a woman, once she does do that, that is when I fell in love with this series. So it was a disappointment. So it's not a book I hated, because at the end of the day, I just grew to love this series. But the first book was definitely a disappointment to me. I remember reading it and I was like, why do people love this so much? Like, I honestly thought I was reading a different volume than what other people were reading. I did continue with the series, and I will be continuing on with the series. But the first one was disappointing to me. Like, I think she could have done a better job with the first one. I'm tired of talking now. So these were the 15 most disappointing books that I read this year. I do have to say, I read over 160 books this year. So the fact that only 15 of them were disappointments is a good thing. I have very much loved a lot of books I read this year, which, if you want to know my top 15 favorite books I read, I'll leave that linked for you. Definitely check that out, because some of these authors do make appearances in that list. So definitely check that out. And I would really love to know, what are the books that disappointed you this year? And I'm not talking about books you hated, but more like books you had such high expectations for and it just didn't meet those expectations for whatever reason. Definitely leave those in the comments below. And I really hope you enjoyed this video. Definitely let me know by leaving a like if you did. And thank you so much for watching. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.